Great to be here tonight with you, to meet you in person. And about time that the two Chases gathered together to talk about the affair Chelsea Manning.
Is that what we're calling it? The affair of Chelsea Manning?
L'affaire Manning.
I'm excited to be here. Thank you for coming. And Chase and I have shared a name for a long time and a profession and our advocacy for Chelsea. So I actually thought we had met in person, but apparently we hadn't. Thank you so much for coming. It is sort of amazing to me that we are able to sit here and talk about Chelsea Manning in a context in which she's getting out of prison in 2 weeks. I sort of can't wrap my head around that reality, and it feels especially important to document and talk about the many circumstances that led to her incarceration, the implications for everything that she did and that happened to her in her whole life, actually, but especially during the period of time following her arrest in 2010 to the present, and then honor the fact that she is still alive and she herself is the driving force behind her commutation. And I think it's so important to center her in all of these stories because she's an incredible human being who has had all of the aspects of her humanity stripped away in a variety of ways, but managed to both survive through that, but also have a vision for her advocacy for herself and for others, and that really enabled the commutation in the end. So, I really do love having the privilege to know her and work with her and share stories about her. I especially love doing that, knowing that it's not always going to be mediated through me and others anymore, that in 2 weeks, knock on wood, and other things that, she'll hopefully be walking, actually 2 weeks from today, out of prison. So actually I'm like really emotional about it. And I'm just so honored to be here with Chase. And so we're gonna go back and forth because we have different areas of expertise and different areas of knowledge related to Chelsea and her case. So Chase is gonna start us off and sort of ground us in some of it, and then we'll go back and forth and we'll open it up to questions. But thank you for being here and for more than anything for caring about Chelsea.
Thank you so much, Chase Strangio, for getting the ball rolling. For those who don't know, the modest Chase Strangio, he's an attorney at the ACLU and has been representing Chelsea Manning in all of Chelsea's claims for transgender justice and dignity within the military penal system. I think making life hell for a lot of the legal staff at Fort Leavenworth and for the prison officials there. And what a wonderful thing to do.
Well, thank you. And don't forget the Department of Justice.
Oh, and the
who
DOJ.
I assume is watching.
Yeah. They've been hate following you on Twitter. And
there's always room to criticize me. So.
Well, that's how you know you're making a good difference. I'm Chase Madar. I'm the author of The Passion of Chelsea Manning, the story behind the Wikileaks whistleblower. We're in talks now to take it to a third edition, undo the dead name, add a new chapter to it that'll talk more about the court-martial, which was just midway through when we published this edition, and talk about the incredible and victorious struggle for a commutation, due in no small part to Chase Strangio. I want to talk, we're going to talk about many things tonight. I want to talk just about the fundamentals of the leak itself, because there are so many important issues colliding in this case. There's transgender justice, there's the Iraq war itself, there's the relationship between secrecy, transparency, and security. There's solitary confinement and American penal norms at home and abroad in our war on terror, and it's really not clear in which place they're worse. 6 months ago, we were talking about this before the gig tonight. I would have been incredibly surprised and in utter disbelief, and you said that you felt the same way, that Chelsea Manning would be getting released from prison. From a pardon, which I think would have been more appropriate, but a commutation is great too, and really beyond anything that either of us had dared to dream. I would have thought, well, this is great, all that's going on, this litigation, this hard legal push for Chelsea Manning, after the conviction. Transgender justice is a cause close to my heart. It's one that I've fought for as a civil rights lawyer myself. But really, you have to address the leaks on the merits. That turned out to be totally false, I am happy to say, and it's taught me a lot, this experience about how you advocate and what's a winning hand in advocacy. But I do want to just say a few things about the leaks, and that's this. Most of the quality media discourse on Chelsea Manning and WikiLeaks has gotten things wrong on a fundamental issue by framing all of this as the tension between transparency and security. That is wrong because it inherently assumes that transparency is a risk against security, or a greater risk than secrecy. The proper way to frame this debate, this important debate, is transparency versus secrecy. Because the dystopian levels of government secrecy that we have in the United States comes at a very high price in blood and money, not just the blood of Americans, but above all, the blood of foreign peoples. It is disgusting that a war that was launched in no small part because of government secrecy, distortion, and lies comes with the very bitter coda, that's assuming that it's finished and it really has not ended, that the Iraq War comes with the bitter coda of a whistleblower, a young soldier who dared to get the truth out, being prosecuted, whereas the perpetrators of the war, the architects of the war, are living in cushy retirement. Secrecy, distortion, and lies were essential to launching the invasion of Iraq. And I say that not in just some metaphysical sense, but in a very concrete sense, that it would have been impossible to convince Americans and to get the government to go along with this war without coming up with a fake case about weapons of mass destruction, without disseminating a lot of lies that there was a connection between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda and 9/11 attacks themselves, but yet this was done. And on the eve of the invasion, a full 70% of Americans, according to one opinion poll, believed that Saddam Hussein had a hand in the 9/11 attacks. It is essential to know the truth about what your government is doing. Transparency is not just a goody two-shoes principle. It is something with very dire and serious and real life consequences. Just think about it for a moment, okay? If you're going to make an important decision, say buying a car, renting an apartment, you need to have all the information you can at your fingertips, or else you're probably going to make a bad decision. Guess what? That applies also to statecraft and invading foreign nations, whether or not to do that. And I can't say that, government secrecy is the only cause of debacles. You can lead individuals and governments to all the right information, and sometimes they will still make the wrong decisions. We all know that. We've all seen it. We've all done it, probably. But that doesn't change the fact that you're much more likely, as an individual or an entire government or society, to make a better decision if it is well informed. Now, we've seen and learned a lot, I think, just in the past 6 months, just how impotent information can be, and we can talk about that. And there are a lot of people suddenly learning how, intelligence and the intellect are quite weak and don't have the catalytic power in politics that many intellectuals and highly educated people would like to think. But still, it is essential to have the facts. And Chelsea Manning is someone who martyred herself. I see her as a secular martyr, a martyr of the Enlightenment, to get the truth out when it really needed to get out. You can read in this book a good digested account of the WikiLeaks files released by Manning, dissected, analyzed, and summed up by experts in various fields, whether it's in Latin America or business or Europe or Asian affairs, about what WikiLeaks, the WikiLeaks revealed by Manning show and teach us about American foreign policy that we did not know before. It's a great deal. Now, we haven't seen this knowledge translated into action yet, into the sweeping changes in U.S. foreign policy that many of us would like, but having the information is the first step, and we have Chelsea Manning to thank for that, and for much else as well.
I think it's incredibly important, especially now when Chelsea's going to reemerge in the media, to have accurate information about what she did, who she is. One of the most alarming things that I find is how quickly people make assumptions about her. And most of the time, they think she's Ed Snowden or Bo Bergdahl. So they don't even actually really know who she is, let alone the nature of the information that she disclosed and the effects of those disclosures. I'm thankful for people like Chase, who spent a lot of time putting into the public domain accurate information about what was happening. And even if we are still not necessarily driven in our decision making or in our public discourse about facts or accurate information or engagement on the actual terms of a debate, it's still so important that that's out there. And I think, you gave me a lot of credit in the opening for the commutation, which is very much undeserved. But to the extent advocates had a role in Chelsea's commutation, it goes back to the people that have been with and been advocating for Chelsea since her arrest in 2010. So I do later on want to talk about the very specifics of Chelsea's conditions of confinement at Leavenworth after her sentencing, but I think it's sort of nice and helpful to talk at the outset about the commutation, because I think it provides a nice arc to think about, well, what does it look like to have a long-term campaign that doesn't look like a traditional campaign for an individual, and what does it mean to have success in a campaign like that? So when Chelsea, I think I want to start with the failures of the LGBT movement, of which I am a part, to really get behind Chelsea in the beginning. And so Chelsea Manning was arrested in 2010. At the time, she was publicly known to be and was out as a gay man. There was also a lot of suggestion that she was trans, it mostly coming out of an email that she had sent her chain of command, which is where we get the picture of her that she so despises, and I still look forward to putting other pictures out into the public domain of her with the wig. And so it was clear that she was a member of the LGBT community at the time of her arrest. And the mainstream LGBT movement in 2010 at the time, you're looking at sort of the beginning of the Obama administration, the shift in successes in the movement, where you start to have same-sex marriage wins. So you have a movement that's already has a lot of normalizing assimilationist impulses, really becoming even more intoxicated by those successes. So Chelsea Manning is the last person on the planet that the mainstream LGBT movement wants to get behind. And even the trans movement, at the time of Chelsea's arrest, I worked at an organization called the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, which is a collective organization in New York City that does racial and economic justice work within the trans community, and we did nothing for Chelsea. And we got press calls, and we got questions about how we were going to support her, and I just don't think we had sort of really reconciled our politics around the U.S. military and other things to have a real coherent approach to supporting Chelsea. But I think that's a real failure of both the trans movement and the larger LGBT movement, which thankfully came around in the end. So I think that's a success story, but I think we have to acknowledge our movement's failures early on and the compromises that we make and who suffers as a result of that. Chelsea did not feel any solidarity from queer people during the period of time after her arrest, and particularly none from any sort of organized movement of queer people that was sort of established in the U.S. So So you have other people, lots of people who are standing up for Chelsea, who are trying to counter the dominant mainstream discourse about who she is and who she was and what she did. And that was essential to keeping her alive. And I think when we're talking about someone who's incarcerated, we have to think of the first thing in any campaign is keeping that person alive. These carceral systems that we have are designed to kill people. And they're designed to kill mostly Black and brown people. That is their purpose. That is why they were set up. That is the nature of our entire legal system. And of course, Chelsea's a white person within that system, but it's still designed to kill everyone. So as an advocacy perspective, you have to keep the person alive. And so that means providing them with the support, the love, the intimate connection, whatever you can to keep someone alive behind prison walls, which means writing their story, which means writing them letters. And that was, I think, the very first most crucial step in the campaign towards Chelsea's commutation. Because if she had died in prison, she would not have been commuted, and we would be here grieving that. And instead, we're able to actually envision a world in which she's alive and advocating alongside us outside of prison. And then, of course, there was the advocacy of her lawyer during her court-martial, David Coombs, who not only was her lawyer and did an incredible job litigating and defending her in that court-martial, but really was her friend. I mean, this is a time when she is cut off from the outside world. She is subjected to horrific conditions of solitary confinement at Quantico. She has no idea what's going to happen to her, and she has very limited access to anyone other than Coombs. And he was a loving, supportive, compassionate attorney who not only fought her case with every single thing in his entire life, but with an unbelievable amount of emotional support, which was critical to her survival. And then as soon as the 35-year sentence came down and she came out as trans, there was a lot of things that Chelsea herself knew needed to happen. And the central thing that we always knew as her advocacy team and the civil team, those of us who have been litigating her conditions of confinement case, and her criminal appeals team, the people who are appealing the conviction and sentencing, have always been incredibly well coordinated and incredibly well coordinated with Chelsea. She guides the decisions, and her vision and our vision was always keep her story alive. That was the only way that she was going to get the medical care that she needed. That was the only way she was going to get any sort of relief in her appeals. And frankly, no one thought a commutation was possible, but it's a nice, it's an even better result. So we had the legal strategy, which was always important, as legal strategies are, but they are never as important as the holistic public advocacy strategy. We didn't know whether we would win or lose in court. In my civil case, we never even had a decision from a judge. So this has been litigated for years. We've had no decisions. It's all been pressure on the Department of Justice, pressure on the public, keeping the story alive. Same with her appeal. She was convicted in 2013. Only one brief has been filed in her appeal in all of these years. And so really what the legal cases were, what they did was keep her story alive. And when she decided that it was important to seek a commutation before the end of the Obama presidency, that was her vision. I mean, that was a Chelsea Manning vision. She actually, Obama could have pardoned her even without the request, but she actually chose just to request a commutation and not a pardon. That's another decision. That was a Chelsea Manning decision. She has a vision for her advocacy, and we were there to support her. And the campaign for the commutation really ramped up in November of last year, after the election, although it wasn't like it was conceived of after the election. It was a campaign that would have happened no matter what the outcome of the election had been. And we had a goal of using the commutation, again, to keep her story alive for the other purposes, to get her sentence shortened through the appeal, to get her access to surgery while she was incarcerated, and to win our case in court that was challenging the forced hair cutting that she had been subjected to. And I'll talk more about that later. And we did not have a vision that we were going to win this campaign for a commutation. I mean, it just did not seem winnable, which also taught me a lot, which is, that we should take on the fights that don't seem winnable. And actually, and this is something I say within the LGBT movement a lot, is that if we're only taking on the fights that we're winning, and as a movement, we've become very used to winning because of taking on very compromised fights, we are doing it all wrong. We should be losing. We should lose our cases and lose forward, and that should be our vision. And Chelsea has been just absolutely central to teaching me that and to have a vision for justice that doesn't seem possible. And the commutation didn't seem possible, but she rallied so many people behind this and keeping her story alive that it was successful. And we can speculate about why Obama did it, and we were talking earlier, I think there are so many factors, and we'll never know. But I like to think first and foremost was the fact that Chelsea was relentless. She was relentless in her public advocacy, and she was relentless in her self-advocacy in prison. She was an incredibly irritating person for them, and I am very proud of her for that. And we were irritating. We are very irritating to the government. If they know that they're just going to have to deal with you, and that they have this person that they just don't know how to manage, and it's a public relations nightmare, and it's a legal nightmare, and it has, this huge appeal that's going to suck up all of this time, and no one wants to do it, and no one wants to give her surgery, but no one doesn't want to give her surgery, and it's just sort of like they just don't want to deal with it. So it's being super annoying, and then appealing to Obama's legacy on trans rights. I mean, this felt really important to me personally. I remember when the Obama administration sued the state of North Carolina after the passage of HB2, the anti-trans law in North Carolina, and Loretta Lynch got up and gave this very moving speech about trans women being women and trans men being men, and we see you, trans people. I'm especially nostalgic for it right now, but it also was so frustrating to watch because at the same time I was litigating against the Department of Justice, and they had been arguing against Chelsea's right to grow her hair because they were subjecting her to the regulations that only male prisoners were subjected to. And so what we did aggressively with the Obama administration is to say, you can't take the position that a trans woman is a woman up until the point of their incarceration. That is absolutely hypocritical and so counter. See, it completely demeans the very integrity of every trans person if you could be stripped of your womanhood at the moment of your arrest or at the moment of your incarceration. And we see this over and over again. So we knew that Obama's legacy on LGBT rights and especially trans rights was important to him. And we were able to not only have the ACLU really push on that, but we were able to get almost every major LGBT organization, every major trans organization, with the exception of HRC, to write a letter to the Obama administration to say, basically, if you care about your legacy on trans rights, on LGBT rights, this is an action that you have to take. And that was incredibly moving for me, and also I think a lot of people, and for Chelsea, to see that evolution of support for her from the complete abandonment in 2010. And then there's just the amazing work of her appeals team, Nancy Hollander and Vince Ward, who are her main civilian counsel, who have been working on her appeal, and then Dave Hammond, who is her detail counsel in the military, and they have been absolutely relentless. It is a huge record that they're dealing with from the court-martial, and you should look at their appeals brief. It's 209 pages. I printed out the table of contents just to remind myself what it was about, but it's really, they are incredible advocates, and Chelsea also guided her defense, and all of these things, and being so thorough and being so relentless, brought us to the point where, President Obama acted in the way that he did on January 17th. And I'm going to turn it back to Chase in a second, but I want to just also tell the story, which is that, we had no idea this commutation was coming. And I've been representing Chelsea for 4 years, and so have her appellate lawyers. Cynthia McFadden at NBC just ran a piece on the Today Show that we had no idea what was coming. And I saw a tweet at 7 a.m. that said Chelsea Manning on the short list for a commutation, and I was like, I don't know what NBC is talking about. And from there, we ramped up the campaign. Like, I was like, we are dropping everything. This is a trial balloon. We need to get out there. We need to show that the public wants this. And so that was that was a Wednesday morning, and her sentence was commuted the next Tuesday. And that was just, it brings tears to my eyes to like go back to that time and think about what it was like to sort of have to taste the idea that this was real after believing there was no chance. And I think Chelsea will get out, hopefully, and tell this story and tell these stories. And it's because people came out to listen to talks about her. It's because people didn't give up on her. It's because people sent her defense fund money. It's because people told her story that she was alive in the first place, to sort of have her sentence commuted. And so it takes so much. And I wish we could do it for every single person who's incarcerated. So it was an amazing experience. And so I think now, shift it back to Chase, and we'll talk more.
I want to heap a little more praise on the legal team that secured this long shot miracle, this wonderful surprise in a year with so many nasty surprises. Let's give it up. I mean, it starts with Chelsea Manning's military lawyer for the court-martial, David Coombs, who's this guy who looks like something out of Top Gun, maybe a little bit older. And to see this lawyer in action at Fort Meade saying these glowing things about Chelsea that were clearly from the heart. He
loves her. Genuinely.
He genuinely admired her. I mean, this is someone with like the wholesome good looks of an astronaut from Central Casting. It was deeply moving and, not really what you'd expect 4 years ago or whatever, but it was great. And that court-martial was absolutely unwinnable, too. But, when you're in a corner, the best thing you can do in a court or just like playing pool is at least set up a good leave shot. And that's what David Coombs brilliantly did while continuing a strong relationship with Chelsea and sustaining his client emotionally. And then moving on to Nancy Hollander and her team. She's such a great lawyer who has done so much important civil rights litigation, whether for Muslims who have been convicted or accused under material support for charity acts for raising money for groups that are 10 degrees of separation removed from Hamas or what have you. And then your work, Chase Strangio, because I can just imagine the U.S. military's position on Chelsea Manning 4 years ago. We're not going to, accommodate this prisoner. We're not going to let her go. That would be an insult to, recently, where they're probably like, oh, just please take Chelsea Manning. We don't want to have to face this anymore, thanks to your, ferocious and unstinting, or you say irritating attacks on them. So that just shows what good lawyering can do. And it is taught me to lose some of my pessimism about what's winnable and what's not. And I think we need to go for more long shots and more things that seem hopeless. So I certainly would not have predicted this. What else I was going to say? The media strategy that you had was brilliant because, a few years ago, I would have said the fact that Chelsea Manning is transgender is an absolute liability, even though transgender justice is getting a kind of a long overdue moment in American media. We're still talking about a minority that is widely resented and oppressed in the United States. There's just no way around that. But the fact that, this was spun in a positive way. I think the first interview that Chelsea Manning gave after her sentencing was with Cosmopolitan magazine. And it was brilliant to have Cosmo do this, instead of some worthy left-wing magazine. And it was this really positive profile by a wonderful seasoned journalist. Didn't go into the particulars of WikiLeaks, which was good strategy, but it was a wonderful human interest story.
It was all Chelsea's idea.
Really?
Yeah,
Okay.
Chelsea was like Cosmo. I want to do Cosmo.
It was brilliant to have that be the first salvo. And then there was ongoing reporting in Cosmo about this. And that turned to be effective. I rubbed my eyes in disbelief about 6 months ago reading in the Lawfare blog. Do you know the Lawfare blog? This is this center-right website, very prestigious contributors and readership for national security law orthodoxy. The ACLU is much too spicy for them. But I rubbed my eyes in disbelief when their editor-in-chief, Ben Wittes, co-authored a piece calling for clemency for Chelsea Manning. Not the full pardon, but a commutation. That would have been unthinkable 3 years ago. And it was very interesting, the logic that Ben Wittes used on the Lawfare blog. It's a joint project of Brookings and Harvard Law School. We're not talking about envelope-pushing people. I mean, it was all about the human connection with Chelsea. And, this person has suffered so much. She has. And Wittes's logic was that, this is someone who is under a time of immense personal stress and turmoil when they committed their criminal act, and also someone who has stepped up and faced the consequences. Now, that's true. You could say that also about at least 90% of the people who are incarcerated in the United States. But still, that was good enough for Ben Wittes,
it was alarming.
who I believe has a transgender child, which is part of why he felt this sympathy. And that's brilliant to use that. I mean, good, effective advocacy means using everything you have, not just a high school debater's mentality, which I kind of had, thinking you have to argue the merits of the league. No, use everything you have. Use some celebrity, get that. And the fact that this was able to be converted into an LGBT cause is terrific. And the more that, some of the more established elite groups, right, like HRC and I think what the Executive Council of the San Francisco Pride Parade reacted against it, the more positive press Chelsea Manning got. Because what was the story? There was a groundswell of support to make Chelsea Manning the Grand Marshal in absentia of the San Francisco Pride Parade a few years ago. And then the Executive Council of the parade nixed it, and with some mealy-mouthed statement that made them look terrible. But this just generated more publicity. And it's interesting to note, I mean, Chelsea Manning's gender identity is, of course, an important part of who she is. It's an important part of who we all are, even, cisgender, white guy, vanilla people like me, that goes without saying. Was it an important and essential part of the leak and the act of leaking? I really don't think so. And a lot of people have argued that, Ooga booga conservatives have come down saying, well, this just shows that you can't trust gays in the military. They're going to leak, and just shows this person was screwed up, that kind of bigoted statement. And that's part of a long tradition of seeing LGBT people as a fifth column who can't be trusted in the military. That goes back to people slagging off Gore Vidal and James Baldwin during the Cold War, saying, look at them, they want to appease the Soviets. The gays, they lack the backbone that we have. But it's important to note that a lot of some transgender groups of veterans really can't stand Chelsea. They thought that she was blowing up their spot and ruining it for all of them. Some sympathetic left-wing people that I've talked with thought, oh, well, that must have had something to do with it. It gave her special empathy with the Iraqi people. I don't think that was part of it. I mean, I think Chelsea Manning did have real empathy with the people. Chelsea Manning actually thought that Operation Iraqi Freedom was going to be about Iraqi freedom. That was Manning's tragic mistake. But I don't think, her gender identity or sexual preference had anything really to do with it. It's an essential part of the Chelsea Manning story, but not of the story of the leak, and that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And I think one of the reasons why trans groups didn't know how to contend with her story in the beginning was because the story that the media wanted to tell was a story about someone who did this because they were trans, not someone who did this who was trans. And so when I would get media calls, I was like, I don't really know what to say here. I mean, because every part of our identity makes us do everything that we do. I mean, you can there's causal connections everywhere, but it's not, this was, by no means the driving force behind any, and Chelsea, of course, can speak to that herself. I mean, she and I don't discuss at length the reason why she did anything. We're more focused forward looking, but I do think, there's such a strong impulse, a human impulse. It's not even one that I fault to sort of draw these connections and to say, well, this explains it. That's what we're doing with Obama and the commutation. Why did he do it? Why did Chelsea do it? We make decisions for complex reasons. I can't say that being trans had nothing to do with what she did. I think her life experiences were experiences that gave her a lot of empathy. She experienced a lot of trauma in life. She had experienced homelessness, as many trans and queer people do. She had experienced abuse. She experienced poverty. She went and, she joined the military for two reasons. One was to get VA benefits to attend college, and the other was because she believed in the United States and wanted to, she's an incredibly patriotic person, far more patriotic than I am. And so, but the fact, she wanted to go to college and couldn't afford it and was desperate to obtain a formal education. And that's what landed her in the military. And I think that path and all of the experience she had as a young queer person, I'm sure contributed to the empathy that she felt and the sort of disillusionment that she felt when she was deployed. But it definitely wasn't, I think it's just very overly simplistic narrative to try to draw that connection, but people are very tempted to do so.
We're fortunate that we'll be able to hear soon enough from Manning herself about her motive. We do have an inkling because in the chat logs with Adrian Lamo, the hacker termed federal informant who turned Manning in, she's very upfront about her motive, and it's a political motive. And a political motive is very hard to understand in a depoliticized society like our own. And there's a long tradition of whistleblowers, not just in the United States, but elsewhere, being instantly pathologized because people cannot conceive of why on earth would you break the law and break the rules and let the truth out like that. There must be something crazy about this person. This is why Richard Nixon sent his goons to break into Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office. People getting analyzed wasn't as big back then as it is now, and they were hoping to find, the crazy dirt on Daniel Ellsberg. In the Soviet Union, political dissidents were often locked up in what were called psikushkas, psychiatric hospitals that were essentially punitive. The idea being that if you are bucking authority here, and criticizing the system, well, you must not be right in the head. We see this again and again. It's very hard for a depoliticized society to accept, let alone understand, a political motive. But Manning's motives, which I write about in my book, and you can read them in the chat logs with Adrian Lamo. They're online. I think Wired published them, and completely. They read like a tragic one-act play for the 21st century. It's just an incredible read. But that Manning wanted people to know the truth, to have better debates about foreign policy. Manning is in the thick of the worst foreign policy disaster this country has had since our Vietnam War, in the middle of the Madain Kada Desert at Forward Operating Base Hammer, and seeing firsthand what an absolute wreck the Iraq War is. The carnage, the throwing money at things, people dying for no reason, political dissidents and reformers in Iraq continuing to get rounded up by the local authorities. The U.S. occupied military is not doing much of a job in spreading any kind of liberal freedoms or democracy. And that is why Private Manning did this, from her own words in these chat logs. And that's something that we don't want to accept. I think in a way that Manning was scapegoated for the whole Iraq war, and that has something to do with why she was prosecuted so aggressively. Whenever we have a failed war, we have to blame someone other than the people who are responsible for it. Now, in Vietnam, you had a vigorous anti-war movement, so we still blame Jane Fonda for that war. And the goddamn hippies. The hippie punching lives ever on. We also blame the media, for betraying us. There's a Dolchstoßlegende, and, they're the ones who sold us out. And sometimes people blame the laws of war for tying both hands behind our back and making it impossible. All of this is nonsense. But in the Iraq war, you didn't have much of an anti-war movement. No offense, I'm sure most of us in this room marched, and I did too, but it was not enough. And the media was only too happy to be a team player. And so who can you blame? Well, blame the young private who had the courage to blow the whistle and get the truth out. I think that was a big part of it. And again, it's just a disgusting finale to the Iraq war. You launch it under cover of secrecy, distortion, and lies, and then you end it, or the first phase of it anyway, by prosecuting the young private who leaked the truth at great personal cost.
I think we want to make sure to leave time for questions. There's a few, hearing Chase talk about Chelsea and the chat logs. I think there's something, I think it's so powerful to sort of follow Chelsea's story, in part because she's this incredibly earnest, compassionate, sort of quiet, visionary person. And there's, I think, in the court martial and sort of the press surrounding it, and even the images that we do have of her being escorted in and out of the facility. I mean, there's so few images of her, but there's there's something incredibly calm about them. And in the face of all of this, she has a calmness and an earnestness to her that I think people don't really realize or get a chance to see because of all of the distortions about who she is. And I've seen those in large part through the lens of transness, and all of the ways she's been pathologized and all of the ways she's been demonized, as many and perhaps most trans people are. But when you sort of get to see her, really see her, and try to see her. It's incredible to think about what it must take to be, 5'4" in the military, weighing 110 pounds, having survived the military system itself, the deployment, and then the arrest, and then the incarceration, the various sites of incarceration in Kuwait, at Quantico, at Leavenworth during the pretrial, back at Quantico, at Leavenworth again. I mean, most people could not survive this, especially not with the calm and sort of relentless willingness to forgive people that she has. A lot of people ask, well, is she bitter? And I'm like, no, she really isn't. She's not bitter. I'm bitter, but she's not bitter. And nothing happened to me. And so, that's sort of amazing. And she'll call me and she'll talk about, Taylor Swift or the Academy Awards and serious things and her vision for the future and of justice and democracy. And I'm like, aren't you mad? I don't say that because why would I encourage her to be mad? But in my head, she is not mad about what happened to her. And that is a really amazing thing and speaks volumes about the person that she is. And she also is very much, and I think you can really see this in her writing, committed to using her story to benefit others. And that has always been true. I mean, the leaks, the disclosures were to benefit others. She knew that they would harm her in the end. And that has been sort of the driving force. And one of the things that has, I think, also allowed her to survive is to sort of imagine what she can do for others. And in the context of her advocacy for herself as a trans person, she's done a lot. In 2013, we were in such a different place in our public conversation about trans people than we are in 2017. I mean, even just when Josh Earnest, the former press secretary, got up there to start testing the messaging around Chelsea's commutation, I was just shocked he was calling her Chelsea. We've come a long way. I was like, the commutation is ridiculous. That's so far off. I'm still getting accustomed to people actually calling her by the right name and using the right pronouns. And that was not happening in 2013 when she came out. And we're not just talking about like by Breitbart. We're talking about by like the New York Times. And so we've really come so far, and Chelsea has been a part of that. She was one of the central figures in the media that forced people, including many people on the left, to contend with transness in our public conversations, because she did have the support of sort of the political, many progressive groups in the United States who were not good on trans issues at all. And so she forced a conversation in a community that needed to be allies with the trans community, and that was something that her coming out did. And she forced the media to start to talk about trans things and people and to be held to account publicly, at the same time that people like Laverne Cox and Janet Mock were also out there who were also doing advocacy. And I think that moment really shifted, or was the beginning of the shift of our conversation, our advocacy around trans rights. And then obviously there was Caitlyn Jenner and other things happened. But Chelsea's really been a central part of that advocacy, and her demand for healthcare during her incarceration, the healthcare that the military's own doctors recommended and said she needed, and her willingness to keep fighting for that, which was just her willingness to survive. She didn't have another option. I think paved the way for the change in policy within the U.S. military. And I think we can argue within the progressive space about sort of whether or not military inclusion policies are the best form of advocacy or priorities. But at the end of the day, I think for the community of people who are currently serving, who need benefits, who need to survive, who often enlist in the military because they don't have another option in their lives, they are not helped by being subjected to discharge for being trans. And Chelsea forced the military to make a bunch of decisions about its position because they were holding her involuntarily and they could not get rid of her. I mean, they ultimately did get rid of her, but for many years they couldn't. And that, I think, also moved military policy. And I do think that the groups of actively serving trans service members who are actively serving and veterans are very divided on Chelsea, but they're not so divided on her, sort of the role she played in moving the conversation forward. I think everyone understands that as much as she came with complications in their advocacy, she also moved the conversation along. And most people came to a point of recognizing that, she deserved the health care that she needed, and that once the military was providing it to prisoners, there was increased the chances it would be provided to actively serving members of the U.S. military, at least. Who knows what's going to happen now with anyone's health care. But, Chelsea was a part of that. And just final note is that prisoners in the United States have been the pioneers and the leaders in moving the ball forward on trans healthcare. They file cases pro se, fighting for their ability to get care and survive in prison, and all the healthcare that trans people have been able to obtain and get insurance coverage for has been because prisoners filed lawsuits that changed the legal standards about medical necessity. And so often it is the people who are incarcerated and most vulnerable who are fighting the hardest and creating the standards that we all then benefit from. So I think it's another lesson about the leadership of people who are incarcerated, as Chelsea has modeled too.
Just to add one thing before we go into the Q&A. Yeah, there's debate about, military inclusion is being developed, but the military is a very important institution in the United States in that it is often the forerunner of major progressive changes. Desegregation in the military was huge because it cleared a path for desegregation in other institutions in the United States. Same thing with gender equality and other welfare state issues. So I think it's a great victory to have more transgender equality and dignity in the U.S. military. And I think that's absolutely going to filter down into other institutions, both government and private, in the United States. So, questions?
The question is basically, well, two questions. One, is Chelsea Manning a political prisoner? And two, you said that she decided to go for commutation instead of a pardon. Imagine that with a pardon, you're completely left free with no restrictions. Following that, is that the same for the commutation? That there are no restrictions she will be living under after she's free?
So I believe everyone is a political prisoner because I don't believe in prison. So that's my answer to that question. And I have a hard time parsing that, but maybe you have a more nuanced answer to that question. On the, the commutation was such a long. It's so hard for me to be like, well, what about a pardon? So the commutation does commute all aspects of her sentence. So she's not living under sentence-imposed restrictions. Basically, the sentence she serves and will hopefully finish serving in 2 weeks will be complete. There are questions about her status in the military. Her appeal is still pending. She's not been formally discharged. I think people think that she already has been discharged. Her sentence included a dishonorable discharge, but that her sentence hasn't been executed completely. So I can't say, I think exactly the nature of any sort of military imposed legal restrictions on her life, but they're not based on sort of the precise nature of the commutation. Now, had she been pardoned, it would have been as if she had never been convicted of anything, and that would have obviously there would be nothing to appeal at that point. It's all. I think that's sort of a complicated legal question, but and a pardon would, of course, be better. But I'm happy with the commutation.
And she's not subjected to any sort of gag. She can openly speak about her experience.
As much as anyone can. I think I am myself. I'm cautious. I'm cautious and paranoid a little bit. There's no formal restrictions beyond restrictions on military service members. But anyone who is a lightning rod for the current president or for the government, I think I am nervous about anything that could happen to her in the future. I don't think there's a chance that the commutation could be undone. I think that's a question people have. You can't. Another president can't undo a commutation. Or even a pardon. There is some sense that a pardon has to actually be delivered because some were interrupted on horseback many years ago. I'm anxious for everyone. I want people to be safe. I can't say, anything could happen, but she's not subject to sort of, additional restrictions that I know of.
I think Manning's choice to request and apply for a commutation rather than a pardon was unquestionably the right decision strategically, because I think there is no way that Obama would have given her a full pardon. That's a recognition that the person did nothing wrong and expunges their whole record. And I cannot see Obama doing that. I think one of the last soldiers to get a full pardon, and this is quite revolting, was Lieutenant William Calley, where Nixon's last act in office was to pardon the leader of the My Lai massacre that killed over 300 Vietnamese civilians systematically and slowly, not through aerial bombardment, but through small arms fire after, taking village. And, it's horrible that the United States, and we're not the only country that treats our whistleblowers much worse than our war criminals. But that's fairly common among nation states. It's the nature of nation states to protect their war criminals very often, more often than not at all costs, but to throw the book at whistleblowers.
So if Obama had pardoned Chelsea, he would be pretty much admitting that he was the one that had.
Yeah. That would have been an admission, if Obama had pardoned Obama, that would have been admission that it was the military and he himself who had done wrong. Now, Chase and I were speculating why Obama did this. Maybe Obama feels a bit burned by the military because while for the 11 months that Chelsea Manning was in punitive isolation confinement at Quantico, and increasingly becoming a global cause célèbre, the military was telling him, oh, we're doing this for the prisoner's own good. Now, we now know, as a matter of fact, that in fact the Quantico military prison's own physician was telling the authorities there, no, this is bad for the prisoner. This is against my medical advice. And it was done for purely punitive reasons. And Obama may not have liked, the way he was hung out to dry, mouthing this, horrible punitive statement to reporters at a press conference. Oh, it's really for Private Manning's own good that we're doing this. Maybe that has something to do with his decision to commute.
It's really difficult to imagine why stripping someone naked every day and locking them in a cell, as she was, would ever be for someone's own good. And it is just unconscionable that, this is, this is what we do.
I want to put both the punitive isolation treatment and the commutation in some general context, because as horrible as Manning's 11 months of isolation were, they're not that abnormal in the United States. We have between 70 and 100,000 prisoners doing long-term solitary confinement in the United States, and this is properly seen as a form of torture. Now, the United Nations has called it cruel and inhumane treatment. That's just one half step below torture, according to their legal definitions. I can imagine situations where there's a very short-term need for such treatment, but it is not the treatment of, short-term last resort. It's the treatment of the first resort very often for tens of thousands of prisoners in this country, and that's an abomination. So in a way, Manning's treatment was par for the course. The commutation, President Obama got some credit for commuting many federal prisoners. The U.S. president only has the power to commute and pardon federal prisoners, not in the state system. And only about 9% of the total prisoners in the U.S. are federal prisoners. The president, the federal government is not the primary law enforcement agency by any stretch. Now, it's true that Obama commuted more sentences than any president in history, but if you look at this as a percentage of total federal prisoners, it was still really miserly. And look how horrible the Department of Justice is. Now, I'd rather have a Southern, conservative like Loretta Lynch than a Southern reactionary like Jefferson Sessions, of course, but I can't give 3 cheers to Obama and the Obama DOJ for these commutations. They should have done blanket amnesties for whole classes of people, for nonviolent drug offenders, for people who were, aging out. It was inexcusable that they didn't. Blanket amnesties have been done in the past, too. It's nothing new. And clemency used to be a very regular part of our penal landscape at the state and federal level in the U.S., and it's died out, unfortunately. This country, gets ever more legalistic and unforgiving, more Kantian with every, passing year, and it's terrible. Another question. Yeah, my old high school friend in the back. I guess it's come to this.
Hi.
Thank you,
Can you hear
Satish.
me?
Oh, yeah, I can hear you all right.
No, so part of this talk is about whistleblowers, and I guess, and in the age of he who shall not be named, you guys who have worked and done this work, we're here because we want to learn from you guys and learn from Chelsea and the experience of all of this, whether it's related to trans, LGBT, or just general civil rights, human rights, whatever it is. Is there any advice you could give us on how we can be, without losing our own jobs, whistleblowers, with a lowercase w, in the everyday we do? And I know that that's what, in some ways, that's sort of what I'm taking from the stories you guys have been telling about knowing Chelsea and hearing that. And I want to bring it back to that idea of how do we be whistleblowers and organize and do this work?
Okay, I'll start us off. Well, so first, I mean, on the topic of sort of whistleblowers in the era of the current presidency, I mean, I do think just to flag, I mean, another strategy in our commutation efforts, particularly in the end, was to say, in light of the sort of machine of state secrecy that our current administration is turning over to this individual who is just terrifying to imagine running it, whistleblowers are going to be more important than ever. And that was a strategy to support Chelsea and to support the idea of a narrative of hope that we would need moving into January. And so that was part of our strategy and was really important. And I think and I do take it as an everyday practice, and I like thinking about it in that way, sort of that small W whistleblower, especially for those of us who are against our mass incarceration and prison machines. For me, the practice of making visible the violence of our state governance systems in all of their sort of machinations, not just the things we think of as traditional sites of detention like prisons and jails, but also homeless shelters, psychiatric, involuntary psychiatric facilities and voluntary ones. Part of how these things operate is through the isolation they enforce, and not isolation like necessarily locking people in isolation, but isolation as removing people from society and sort of collective monitoring. And so I always think, well, what we can do is break down the impulse to lock people away, break down the government desire to make invisible the violence that they're perpetrating in innumerable ways to the people that are incarcerated, both incarcerated physically and incarcerated through state surveillance and other policing mechanisms. And so I think that practice has always been, was important under Obama, is important now. That has been sort of the legacy of our systems of chattel slavery and mass incarceration. If we just let people sort of be hidden away in these systems and not talk about what happens in them, not talk about people being denied water, and when we talk about it, not talk about it, as you point out, as an exception. This is the rule. This is what happens all the time. Black people are murdered by the police all the time. People die in prison all the time. And so it's important to make it visible and also not make it seem exceptional. And I think that's part of our obligation.
To talk about whistleblowers now in the time of Trump, I mean, it's just full of paradoxes, because the difference we're going to see is one of degree, not of kind. Obama had a terrible record in going after whistleblowers. He prosecuted more people under the Espionage Act of 1917, retooled as an anti-leaking cause of action, than all his predecessors combined. And I think maybe part of his motive of commuting Chelsea Manning's sentence was to undo some of that really bad reputation he had earned. Washington is obsessed with leaks and secrecy. We have at the same time constant leakage, okay? I think that's pretty much always a good thing. I can think of some things that really deserve to be secrets, but that's a very tiny percentage of the millions of documents that our federal government classifies each year. And you have leaks from high sources. Rahm Emanuel, when he was Obama's chief of staff, was famous as a virtuoso of leaking. His successor, William Daley, called him the leaker in chief and, compared unfavorably his own kind of pedestrian leaking skills to Emanuel's. And people leak for all kinds of reasons. Manning for very honorable reasons. The people need to know what's going on. We're in the middle of a foreign policy disaster. We need to avoid these in the future. But people leak, as a trial balloon to test out reactions to a policy. They leak as a way of, communicating with another branch of the government when it's actually secret and they're not supposed to. They leak as a way to sabotage a rival in the government. Leaking is always political. This is something that I wish people understood more. It's not leaking something about the war in Afghanistan or about John Podesta's, how he runs Hillary's campaign. It's not like publishing something in the Journal of Organic Chemistry, just pure knowledge for the sake of knowledge. Isn't that interesting? As long as that's accurate, that's fine. It always has a political angle, political charge, and political force to it. It's interesting that Wikileaks has been stabbed in the back by Trump. I think it's terrible that Trump's DOJ is moving to prosecute WikiLeaks, even though I've run out of all sympathy for Julian Assange. I've really had it. I think he made a terrible decision to cast his lot with Fox News and with Trump as he did. And WikiLeaks has gone from being Enlightenment heroes, I think, to a sideshow to Alex Jones' InfoWars, where Assange has been a frequent guest.
He's also just a terrible person.
And among his other kind, but to be tweeting for WikiLeaks to tweet about Pizzagate, how pathetic is that? How low they have fallen. Now, I don't rule out the possibility that they may continue to do some good things, but my God, they need a change of leadership. And if you look at, all the tragedies that are coming from the Trump side, I just, have even less sympathy for Assange. I mean, just get out of the picture. It's time. I'm looking forward to Laura Poitras's new movie about Assange because I'm sure it's going to be complex. But, okay, at the same time, Washington made a huge fuss out of these leaks. Again, the quality media, like the New Yorker, the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, that kind of place, the Atlantic Monthly, they looked at this through the wrong end of the telescope. And there was this ridiculous panic about, it could be a slippery slope to total transparency, at which point the government will cease to function. Do you remember slippery slope arguments from your first semester in law school? You hear a lot of them, and leaving the barn door open. But people kind of wise up after the first semester, most people. This is ridiculous. What Manning leaked, first of all, none of it was top secret. Nothing has been linked to any damage to foreign civilians or American soldiers, even though the U.S. military had all the time in the world to make that claim in their long court-martial. There is still widespread overclassification measured in the millions. And the total, even though this was the biggest leak in U.S. history, it was still well under 1% of what Washington classifies in a given year. The real problem that we have and the real liability for national security and for world peace is overclassification, dystopian levels of secrecy, where, you measure declassification in Washington in centuries. It's a geological tempo. I'm not exaggerating. It was only in 2011 that the NSA declassified documents from the James Madison administration dating back to 1809. The CIA still has documents classified from the First World War. And, it was only recently that things from the Bay of Pigs were declassified. This is ridiculous. It was the inability for our intelligence agencies to communicate with each other due to overclassification that made preventing the 9/11 attacks impossible. And that was, if you're looking for the cause of that inside the national security apparatus, it's not because we didn't torture enough people or torture, it's because of overclassification, secrecy, and an inability for our gargantuan mess of a national security apparatus, which has only gotten more gargantuan, more, overfed, more sprawling, and more unwieldy, that leads to bad results. What was the question again?
How do you whistleblow?
What was the question? The question was...
No.
That was a good answer. Both of you. No, I just think that all of us here in this room are here, self-selective, we're here. What do we do? Should we, is somebody a children's writer? Should we write a book about whistleblowing and make that...
That's a great idea.
Yeah, I think it is a great idea. One of us who should write it, and Verso should publish it. and set it out to make it okay.
It's a good racket, children's books. Yeah.
No, to make it okay to say. You know, when you're growing up, narking on somebody or ratting somebody out, that's not what you do. And this whole thing, and the idea of Chelsea, and it goes back to it, because this is what this is about, is I think that she was so alone. That's what the most incredible thing about it is. By herself, whether it was before, during, and then in solitary, is kind of the most amazing part about this whole thing, right? And forgetting that part of it, I think we're forgetting what we do now. Like each of us, what are we going to do after this, right? Literally, what are you going to do after this? And how do we say, what did you do tonight? I went to this talk. Yeah. And then what?
You've given us room for introspection. Thank you, Satish.
I am.
But also, I just want to respond to two things that you said. I mean, the first is that she was so alone, and I think that lots of people are so alone. She was alone, and one of the things, as I said, that kept her alive was people's willingness to connect with her, and that is something that we can and should do with people who are in and out of prison, is connect. And then the other thing about the children's book point, and sort of we teach people that it's bad to, we teach kids that it's bad to tell other people's secrets, which has a host of problems and around lots of things that we could discuss. But the thing is too that about I have a kid and I think about this a lot, which is that we don't enough teach our kids about power and power dynamics and who has power and and sort of who doesn't have power and what the difference is to act against the powerful versus to act with the powerful. And so I think we have a lot of responsibility actually as parents to be, especially white parents, but other of white children, to sort of really teach our children about power, because that's going to be really important too.
Thank you for speaking with us. So I have two quick questions. One is jumping off of the previous point. How do we talk to non-politicized people? Or for instance, I talked to my mom about Edward Snowden and other whistleblowers, and they're like, no, they're traitors. And I'm like, what? So I feel like there's a real disconnect between, in terms of the amount of knowledge that just typical people have from what the media gives to them. But there's also a kind of blind allegiance to the state, which is connected to the media and connected to the way that we're socialized in this country. And my second question is for you on the right, Chase, correct?
Yeah, we're both Chase.
We're both Chase.
Yeah.
Oh, really? Okay, interesting. So my question is, for someone who's interested in law or thinking about law, how do you marry your kind of activist tendencies, radicalism, and really for me, not really even a belief in the law for me, with kind of the systems that we're forced to engage and deal with in order to produce change? And how do you deal with that tension in your personal practice and day-to-day life, and what suggestions or kind of advice do you have for someone who might be thinking about law?
Shall I do the first one and you can do the second question?
Sure, yeah.
So to answer your first question, how do you convince people? That's the big question. As Edward Said used to like to say, that one of the tasks of the intellectual is aesthetic. It's not just logic and reasons and evidence. You have to spin it in a way and put it in a way that appeals to people. And you have to know your audience. How you talk to your mother about Edward Snowden might be very different about how you talk about the same subject with someone else in a different setting, in a classroom, in a public forum, in a family gathering. The task is never to convince everyone, too. It's really smart to give up on people, okay? Not all people, but some people. The task is
something.
only to convince people, enough people to get your way. And, I've done public speaking, advocating for Manning's case in a lot of different places. Some of them a bit out of the way, as part of Occupy Wall Street, doing teach-ins, public teach-ins, the public library steps. I gave a talk at the Mississippi State Capitol on Veterans Day in 2015. I talked about it in a little different way there. That was kind of anticlimactic. The people there had lovely manners, had fond memories of Jackson, Mississippi. But how you talk about things in a classroom where it's expected that you can appeal to logic and reasoning might be different. And you have to, slip the knife in the right way. I regret in my book not being a little more subtle in the first chapter. Instead, I come down like a ton of bricks on the reader. But you have to, always find a way to appeal to your listener or your reader in a way that, is sympathetic to them too, and casts them in a positive role, or potentially a positive role in this. Recruit them as an accomplice, rather than, talking to them like an obstacle.
How do you do that when our country is built upon only progressive systems in which people believe?
Our country's divided, fruitfully divided. And just, to go back to Snowden, whom you talked about, there are a lot of Republicans who are sympathetic to Snowden, okay? Each party is very split on Snowden, and this is reflected in votes in the House, Yeah, it's, the horrible election of Trump, I don't think should be seen as a referendum that America is completely fucked. There are long-term problems that we have that are still bad, a little worse now. There's potential for real disaster, but there are openings too. I find not being a Debbie Downer or a negative Nelly is a good thing. Again, and to go back to this, surprise victory in the case of Chelsea Manning. Who would have thought that a commutation was in the works? This is a great victory. There are victories. Learn from them.
Yeah, and I would add, people are really complicated and do a lot of compartmentalizing. I have a Trump supporter parent and a brother who is in the military, and you find your way to find your common ground, and maybe you can convince them of some things and not of others. And I think it is all about audience and strategy and moment. And actually, I think in some ways this is the same answer to the question of sort of how you act as a lawyer in a system you don't believe in. I don't believe in our legal system, but I engage with it because I feel, for me, it is an effective tool of advocacy, and I never practice law in isolation. I think as the sort of commutation example demonstrates, I don't believe the courts will save us, not now, not ever. I think that's a dangerous strategy and a dangerous rhetoric that, we're turning to the federal courts a lot right now, but they will not save us. And they are a tool. I think it's important to keep in perspective the limited role that the law should play in sort of, especially in litigation and legislative advocacy, and the important role that power building and mobilizing and organizing and public education and public narrative framing will play. I believe in using every tool that there is in the toolbox. I believe in, calling famous people. I believe in lobbying in Texas. I believe in litigating cases. I believe in whatever it takes. I believe in harassing the New York Times as much as I harass the Department of Justice, and sort of using every strategy. And being a lawyer gives, for me, it gave me a sense that my voice could be seen as legitimate, and that's just the honest truth that we devalue lots of people's voices, and if you get a certain degree, you may have authority to your voice that you might not otherwise have had, and I wanted that, and I've tried to use it to the advantage of my clients. There's lots of other people who have written really good things on this question, so we can talk to more about that.
I mean, the revolution will not be impact litigated, but you could still get a fair amount done with impact litigation. I mean, the victory against stop and frisk in New York was, I hate to give impact litigation any credit. That's my revenge for getting bad grades in law school, but I got to give the Center for Constitutional Rights credit for, helping to undo stop and frisk.
But even, I mean, and that is true, but at the same time, the system adapts, the harms adapt. And so we have to, like, for example, when the Supreme Court ruled in Coleman and Plata, which were these two cases against the California prison system, they were conditions of confinement cases, and the remedy was actually that California had to let people out. There are too many people in their prisons. It seemed like the ultimate victory. They're still litigating that case. They just transferred people to private prisons. It's like, it will adapt even when you get the best possible victory in the court. So it's just, it can never be just that, but those decisions were really important. The stop and frisk decision was important. And so it's something, it's not much.
Can I just make a point about the stop and frisk thing? Because like you just said, the system adapts. And one way in which the NYPD continues to criminalize black people, especially black youth, is to follow their social media accounts and to wrap them up in conspiracy charges, like the Bronx Youngs funny last year. So again, like the system does adapt, and that's why I have a really hard time with the answer about don't be a negative Nancy, Debbie Downer, and also all those different things, because at the root of it is like something at the root of the opinion, and that needs to be uprooted. And how do we do that? And I'm not continuing the question, but I just wanted to make that point.
The answer to that is also a matter of where should the responsibility lie. So if you are a person who is existing at the receiving end of a system of oppression, should it really be up to you not to be the Debbie Downer?
People generally find Debbie Downers to be a downer. I mean, it's okay to be sad sometimes, sure, but I don't understand your question really.
Okay. I think that the responsibility for not being the Debbie Downer, the responsibility for setting things right should lie with the oppressor, the person who has the power, not with the person who is being oppressed. It seems to me that there is an element of victim blaming when you're asking someone not to be negative, when they have every reason to be negative.
I mean,
How can we be strong for people and be positive for people who need it without expecting them to do the same?
I mean, that for me is one of the, I looked at myself and thought, I have a lot of access and a lot of power. I'm a white, I was like, I'm a trans person who wants to serve my community, and sort of comparatively speaking, I have a lot of access and power, and what can I do with it? So that's why I decided to, so I see I agree. I mean, I think the responsibility is those of us who can locate our power and understand it and see how we're reinforcing power structures to take them on. And so that was my why did I go to law school piece in some way, which was I was going to have access to these systems. I was going to already benefit from them. I was going to be the person who was going to be let in the door. I'm still seen as a little bit of a freak when I'm in the door, but still I was going to be let in. And so, so that for me is sort of what I sort of make a calculus in all my decisions, which is sort of what is the cost, who can I benefit, how can I use my access to improve the circumstances of the people who are going to be locked up or who won't have that. And I see that as sort of I don't put an expectation on what other people should do. I sort of say, I want to be the person that uses the platform and the access that I have to lift up the issues that I care about. And I think that's another reason why I sort of thought, okay, I can engage with this system that I don't believe in.
You in the front.
Chase, do you have a sense of what Chelsea wants to do in 2 weeks and going forward? I know we'll have hopefully the chance to ask her ourselves, and it might put a little pressure on you to be in the position now. But do you have any sense at all from anything you've heard or read or talked with her about what she wants to do, what she'd like to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so what I'll say first, sorry, I need a little water, is that, we don't do a good job of supporting people in in getting out of prison and doing recognizing that there's an emotional trauma that's gonna come that is ongoing and that you can't just leave institutionalization and be okay or even know how you're gonna be. And so I, caution her and sort of want her to have the space to say, I had no idea I would be feeling X, but I am, and I need the tools to get medical care, or take a break or whatever. So I don't know what she's gonna do. I think we wanna give her the space and the time to decide. I think her goal long term is to go to Maryland, where she does have family. She likes the DC area. She tweeted about that. I'm not gonna say anything else beyond that, because I just really want to just not create any expectations for her. And one thing I'm also nervous about is it is so exciting that she's having her sentence commuted and that she's getting out. And I think that she will likely feel a lot of pressure to be something for other people. She's always represented things and never, thank you so much, had the ability to sort of define things. And it is not going to be easy to leave prison. It's it's so exciting, but it's going to be really hard. And so, I just want her to have the space to get her needs met, like financial, health, logistical, whatever they may be. But there's just no way, knowing who Chelsea Manning is, that she's not gonna dedicate her life to advocacy in one way or another. And she feels so excited and committed to that. And I know that will be sort of where she is in the long term, whatever that might look like. And we will be hearing from her in one way or another. And I'm just excited for everyone to get to see and know her more, which I think she does really want to show herself in every way. I mean, she hasn't been able to craft her image to tell her story, and that's really exciting. And I think she will do that, and really is looking forward to that.
First of all, thank you very much again for this rare encounter.
Sorry. I actually didn't want the water.
Take your time. No, thank you very much, and congratulations again.
Sorry.
I think that everybody have asked already.
No, I don't need more water. Don't give me more water.
But I have one very specific question. It's about something I will always remember from the whole story of Chelsea being imprisoned and being in confinement. Is when she started to tweet for the first time. Like, I remember the first tweet, like, I think it was something like, hey, this is my new Twitter account or something like that. And I thought that it was totally surreal. Like, how is this happening?
How is her Twitter happening?
So that my question is, like, how did that happen? How was it possible that she could start to tweet? And yeah, were you involved in some way, or who was involved, and how was that possible?
Yeah, so Chelsea's Twitter account, that made me nervous at first. So it was her idea, of course, as that's a theme. And yeah, I mean, she wanted a voice. And so Chelsea, unlike most prisoners in the United States, has phone access, significant unlimited phone access. So I'm able to speak, there are times when I speak with her every day. Or that she's able to call people almost every day. And that has allowed a lot of the advocacy, because some of the stories that sort of unfolded, we were able to document what was happening in real time and know that she was being disciplined for the toothpaste in the Caitlyn Jenner magazine, for example, in part because she was able to call us and we were able to find these things out. And most times with people who are incarcerated, they don't have phone access. They have very limited phone access, very expensive phone access. So you're communicating by letter, which is incredibly slow because you can get a letter and the thing is already over. So the phone access was the thing that enabled the Twitter account. If she had been sending us letters with tweets, it would have been really difficult. But she had called in the tweets. And various people have helped her run the Twitter account. But those are her tweets, and the replies and the retweets are as well. So she spends a lot of time on Twitter in her own way. And that has been also a part of keeping her in the public conversation.
Was that right after Quantico or?
The Twitter account? No, it was about a year into her sentence. So she was sentenced and started serving her time at the disciplinary barracks at Fort Leavenworth in 2013. And I think her Twitter account started actually maybe in 2015. And so that was part of just the conversation. And what, we always wanted things that we could support her doing when there were lulls in the other work. So lulls in the litigation. I mean, her litigation kept her busy, focused on the healthcare case, focused on her appeal. But there's always lulls in those things. And so being able to engage with the public through Twitter, especially for someone who is self-described millennial who's 29 years old who likes social media but has no access to it. Twitter was a real opportunity for her to sort of engage with people, and I know she's really enjoyed having the tweets of other people read to her and thinking up her tweets as well, which she writes. If she wants, sometimes I'll be like, "What about this?" She's like, "No, that's terrible."
The ACLU has had kind of a thankless job the last 8 years, litigating against a lot of the bad things Obama was doing, including the Chelsea Manning case. And in the last, 6 months, it's been an outpouring of warm and fuzzies. How do we on the left kind of seize on that and change the democratic discourse?
I'm kind of stopped from saying anything because I'm married to the ACLU. My wife's a lawyer in the Human Rights Division of the ACLU and colleague of Chase Strangio's. And what I hear about the ACLU, I'm at the dinner table. I'm not allowed to say it.
Well, I feel like I can criticize the ACLU. But yeah, no, I mean, I think it's very surreal that the sort of way ACLU is situated at the moment in the public conversation, and I think we have a real we're a nonpartisan organization. We have a real responsibility to not be partisan in our advocacy. But in terms of I think we just right now, and I don't, in terms of, I don't precisely, understand exactly, like, is your question ACLU specific or just the left specific, or?
Basically how we seize on Manning's victory and the ACLU's outpouring of support because of opposition to Trump into changing dialogue generally.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the way that my way to do that in a way that feels long-term in its thinking is to leverage this support to tell stories that stretch back in time, that we don't talk about harms as starting on January 20th, and that all of the things that we're criticizing now were things that were happening before. And so I think one of our problems in this country is our, ahistorical approach to everything. And so what we can do now is say, oh, are you interested in this now? Let me tell you also about how this was playing out before. All the ways that things that came before made it possible for what's happening now to happen, or happened exactly the same way, we just didn't talk about it in the same way. And so that, that's always how I think about our responsibility, is to be more, historically minded and sort of tell the story of a story that descends back very far in time, and that, we have a lot of responsibility to disrupt in our current advocacy, and that lots of people have been doing the work for a long time.
I'm going to break my silence and answer this a little bit. I think there's a real risk, even though the ACLU has done great work, cutting-edge work under Democratic administrations, especially the past 8 years, but there's a real risk now of the ACLU, I think, becoming too much of an anti-Trump organization rather than a civil liberties organization, and falling too much within the orbit of the Democratic Party and all the very real liabilities that entails. And I think that the ACLU would do well to remember its core missions for the rights of prisoners, immigrants, not in a way that makes them, extra palatable for mainstream Democrats, but to keep pushing the envelope. That's their damn job. That's their mission. And I think, specifically what that means too is, focusing on how to deal with people who've committed violent crimes, which contrary to liberal mythology, that's the majority of the prisoners in the U.S. I mean, you can define violence in different ways, but you release every nonviolent drug offender in this country, we still have the highest incarceration rate in the world, okay? And for immigrants too, it can't just be about anti-Trump. It has to be going full blast for civil liberties for the people who need them most, and not just an annex of the Democratic Party.
And there's plenty of work to do in the states. And so if we're going to be about a sanctuary, or in the city, we're going to be a sanctuary city. Well, are we a sanctuary city for Black people? Are we a sanctuary? There's lots. There's plenty of lawsuits to bring against Democratic, governors, again, in state legislatures. There's plenty of, places to sort of push the envelope, as Chase was saying, and be more bold in our thinking, and not just look at the enemy as the Trump administration.
I think it's important. You can celebrate whistleblowers now in a way that you can't when a Democrat's in power. Because, most of our national media tilts Democrat in a way. They're not left-wing on any stretch on war and peace issues or important economic justice issues. But they do kind of tilt Democrat, and they're going to soft pedal. I don't think President McCain or Romney could have ever gotten away with doing to Chelsea Manning thanks, Joel, what was done to Manning under President Obama. There's no way. But under Trump, I think there's an opportunity to celebrate whistleblowers and promote whistleblowers as everyday heroes, as role models, as examples, moral examples, and less because of the content of their leaks. I mean, the actual consequences of leaking information tend to be disappointingly minor. There's a lot of smoke and, a loud boom, but then not much of an impact. I mean, information just does not have the catalytic power that intellectuals like to think it does. Hidden information, it's a great MacGuffin in movies and spy novels. In real life, information is not that powerful. But what is surprisingly powerful is the drama and the moral example of whistleblowers, even if, the consequences of their actual leaks tend to be not so big. And that's something that can be pushed, and that's something that, all kinds of groups can do, because we're going to need whistleblowers just as symbols to rally around in the Trump site. And, I think we're going to see plenty of that. The technological change makes it easier to track whistleblowers down and find them, but it also makes it easier to leak things. And that's something that cannot be squashed out. The human factor will not be squashed. And it's amazing to me just how many of the important national security breaches have been really low tech. Manning's leak was not, something out of Mission Impossible 6 with suction cups on the walls and then the ceiling. It was really, there was no information security, InfoSec, to speak of in the military bases SCIF, secure compartmented information facility, I think it's called, where Manning was stationed. And it was incredibly easy to just leak these things on a writable, CD-ROM and then send it to WikiLeaks through a Barnes & Noble in the Maryland suburbs of D.C. It was easy to do that, and it will still be easy to leak. Manning totally would have gotten away with it, too, if she had not confessed in a moment of real loneliness to this federal snitch, Adrian Lamo. I mean, she totally would have gotten away. So, a lot of the tech press gets really snowed and gets really worked up about technological advances. But there will always be some ways to evade technologies, and technologies, in a way, can make it easier to leak as well as to track down leakers. So, there are cracks in dystopia. Again, I'm sorry, usually I'm the most depressed, negative person in the room, and I'm sounding like, some goddamn Pollyanna tonight. But your lovely audience, thank you for making me feel that way.
Cheers. Well, thank you guys so much for being here tonight in this panel, and more importantly, just all of your work. And I really am like excited as we're kind of maybe sitting into some positivity and some optimism. I really look forward to a day when we can look back, and whether it's a national or international, we don't have borders, but we are able to celebrate whistleblowers, collectively as a society and what they do and what they contribute. Or we don't actually even really have to worry about it, but we will actually really be able to celebrate your heroic work, because I think we will reach that point eventually. I think that's the direction. But going back to what you were, Chase, on my left, you're right. You were just mentioning regarding just kind of the how simplistic a lot of the information is just kind of residing out there, how easy it is to transfer. I remember watching a panel discussion with on C-SPAN. Someone was, I can't remember what governmental agency they were a part of, either the FBI or NSA, and they were talking about building out psychological profiles to really identify whistleblowers early on, as well as overall governmental shifts, employees working in pairs, these kinds of things. And I'm wondering, granted this was years ago, but I'm curious if you've been up to date, or if you know of overall policy shifts or ways in which actually the government is actively pursuing and trying to advert or even preempt whistleblowing activities.
I can't remember the name. It was a federal program. Maybe you remember it. Of trying to fight and preempt whistleblowing, not just in the military or the national security branches, but in the Department of Education, the Department of Energy. And it struck me as just one more marvelous waste of, federal tax dollars. I wonder how seriously it's implemented. I have a hard time imagining that it's rigorously enforced. I think it's probably a lot of bullshit and very ineffectual. I don't think they should be doing it. I think it's bad, don't get me wrong, but I don't think that's going to tamp down leaks so effectively. It's dystopian that they're doing it at all. And I just wanted to point out the idea that government should be reasonably transparent, that's not some decadent new idea cooked up by the brats at Wikileaks. That's a very old idea. That's one of the cornerstones of, Republican or liberal or progressive political theory. And people use all these neologisms to describe what WikiLeaks does. Oh, we should crowdsource foreign policy thinking. Use the hive mind. No, that's just called democracy, okay? People should make informed decisions collectively. That's a very old idea. And it's not something that's going to be crushed by these, sad little, federal programs to rat people out. I mean, I'm sure that's probably causing some people headaches, and it could even be ruining some careers. It should be rolled back, and it's a disgrace on Obama's presidency that he enacted that. They should be doing the opposite, to declassify things and open up government. And again, not just for its goody two-shoes own sake, but because we're going to get much better results that way. The greater the amount of secrecy in government, the more disastrous it's going to be. The more ineffective, the more dystopian it's going to be. Something we should have learned from, the Soviet system and other authoritarian systems of government. That's an object lesson, not a role model.
There was also, I forget the name, I'm trying to remember, it was like a year and a half ago, and we gave the story to The Guardian. I think we did, I can't remember which FOIA it was, but we got information about a psychological profile that they had been trying to build about whistleblowers using Chelsea. It was so bizarre. And they did use her transness. I mean, that was it was sort of a way to pathologize her. I mean, like you were saying, sort of what is the pathology that leads to whistleblowing. I'm like, great, if it's transness, that's awesome, because we're awesome. So we're, are inherently disruptive of power, which I do believe in. But yeah, so it was really interesting. It's out there. We published it. It's just sort of a fascinating thing to see, that way they tried to build a psychological profile of the whistleblower using Chelsea.
I think like the whole science of profiling, it's great for serial killer TV shows and novels, but Malcolm Gladwell, whom I take as gospel, wrote an article about this in the New Yorker about what pseudoscience it is. It's ridiculous. Although anecdotally, I have heard that one venerable sociologist at Columbia, Herbert Gans, I think his name was, found a strong correlation when he was, doing contract work for the U.S. military to find out if a soldier was going to be really accident prone and causing accidents, in his unit back then. There was a strong correlation between that and if they answered yes to the question, have you thought about joining the FBI? Is that it? Has it come to the? Okay. Thank you all very much.
Thanks for coming.